Decoded, The Future of Health, hosted by Dr. Vinod Gaba and Alex Kummerman. Today's special guest is Ali Hashemi, CEO of Metabolic, discussing healthspan pragmatism and quantifiable outcomes.
I'm delighted to welcome today Ali Hashemi, who has an introduction that could go on and on. But just to summarize what he's doing right now, he's a serial entrepreneur. He's a CEO of Metabolic, which is a hybrid healthcare platform revolutionizing metabolic disease management through AI, wearables, and behavior-driven clinical care. Welcome, Ali, to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Ali, tell us a little bit about your journey in terms of the passion of what's really brought you here and what's brought you to Metabolic.
Well, let's talk about the geographic piece first. What brought me here? We're in Dubai. What brought me here was, curiosity. I was living in New York City at the time. I was working at a consulting firm and got a call from a headhunter that another competitor was interested in building a healthcare practice for the Middle East. And I thought that would be a fun thing to do. So I applied for the job, even though I was not qualified at all. It was way over my pay grade, but somehow managed to convince the partners that they should give me a shot. So came out, ended up building what became one of the largest healthcare advisory practices for the region. So I moved from Bain to Booz Allen Hamilton at the time, then it became Booz & Co. And that was really the genesis of, let's start nerding out immediately, use a medical metaphor. It was a great viral vector for me, right? It injected my DNA directly into the ecosystem's DNA. And almost, overnight, I was privileged to have access to, decision makers at a very senior level, agendas at a very senior level. And we started doing really interesting strategic work. So that's kind of how the geographic move to the region started, but also the accumulation of the content, intelligence, and comfort that then later enabled, the jump to becoming an entrepreneur. So I spent, 5.5 years traveling all around the GCC, working with governments and ministers and business owners on, national healthcare strategies, on feasibility studies, on, M&A activity. So we had a really broad spectrum of very interesting work. And, if anyone in the audience is out there trying to figure out how to build a career or start a career, management consulting is great for that because it forces you to become an expert in some new thing within a week, right? So there's this cadence of learning that is just nonstop. And that's intense, but it's also really helpful when it comes to building the connections and the content that you would need later as an entrepreneur. So at some point I got bored. I shouldn't say that. At some point, advising people wasn't enough for me. And I wanted to go back to building something. I had already started and failed a company when I was much younger. So at Duke, I was an engineering student. Before going to medical school, I invented a device for women to be able to do their own Pap test at home. And I knew nothing. Wow. I was a clueless 21-year-old. Didn't know what a cap table was. No idea what stock options were. I was a nerd in the lab. Yeah. But launched this company with a group of investors. We ended up failing because they didn't raise enough capital to get the product to market. But that itch I had, became something I had to scratch at some point. So left consulting in 2012, launched a subacute care platform, nothing tech about it. You could argue it was a longevity play because we were really extending the healthy lifespan of patients with very debilitating, mostly genetic diseases and syndromes. So very rare conditions that were born out of consanguinity because there's a lot here. So we built a long-term acute care hospital and then built the region's first private rehab hospital focused on stroke, traumatic brain injury, car accidents and such. So pretty heavy stuff. And no one had done it before. So really from an entrepreneurial perspective, it was challenging because, gosh, it was hard to raise money. We can get into that if you want. So no one would write me an equity check because they thought we were insane for building hospitals. But then also the regulations didn't really exist, especially on the rehab side. So we had to work with the government to actually draft a framework of regulations that would eventually govern ourselves. And that took a degree of, making sure that you do things in a way that withstands the sunshine test and so on. So that was kind of the genesis of moving here, understanding the market, getting comfortable, taking the risk. And so we ended up building, quite a nice business, sold it end of 2018 to the sovereign fund here, Mubadala. And then started on the journey that we're on now, which, kicked off in 2019, which is really to look at a much bigger problem. Subacute care and the LTACs and the rehab, filled a gap in the market, but it wasn't a globally scalable business. It was a great business, but it was limited to this market. And I think there was a personal connection too to metabolic health, given all of us it's touched all of us somehow. You've probably got a relative, and you've probably got a relative. My grandfather died of complications related to poorly controlled diabetes. And so it was a very personal issue. My co-founder, his father is a diabetic. My wife's father is diabetic. Right. So we all have it, right? And so there was a sort of an aha moment that my co-founder and I had, where he had already built one of the largest metabolic health, diabetes clinics in the region, maybe in the world, Imperial College London Diabetes Center in Abu Dhabi. And they have 100,000 diabetics, but the outcomes are not actually that amazing. After a decade of investment, the outcomes were, and this is published, about 75% of the patients were still poorly controlled. So you start to ask yourself, why is that? Yeah. And as we dug into that, where we came to was the care model itself was doing what it was incentivized to do in terms of fee for service and so on, but it wasn't serving the patient well. And now data was available to allow caregivers to be much more present and continuous. Yeah. So in a nutshell, what we built was an omni-channel healthcare service, which owns and operates all of the traditional elements. We have a lab, we have a pharmacy, we have all the doctors and nurses and caregivers and educators and dietitians and fitness coaches and like everything a diabetic needs. But we also built a very robust tech stack. We integrated all of the wearables that we possibly could to capture minute by minute data. And then we started using and visualizing and analyzing that data in service of our patients. And I think what we discovered along the way was it's not about the tech and it's not about the AI. It's about your ability to make that technology useful in the context of helping your humans become better versions of themselves. Make your doctor be more human when dealing with the human patient in front of her or in front of him. And so that's kind of the journey at a very high level in a nutshell. We can dive into any aspect of that you want.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing this. I think it's extremely interesting. And so can you just dive a bit deeper into this hybrid model where on one side you have, let's say the clinic care approach, and on the other side you have the wearable approach, and how this was a moment in your career?
Good question. We don't see it as like one side versus the other because it's entirely harmoniously built. It's imbued within the way that we practice, right? Okay. So the philosophy that every action, every conversation should be data driven is there, whether you're talking about the health coach or the endocrinologist. So we retrain our people to become programmed to be data first and data driven and evidence based. And so as we start talking about how this applies within the context of healthspan and longevity, we bring a degree of clinical rigor to everything that we do because it's all backed by an inordinate amount of evidence and data. And we publish voraciously. Yeah. You don't expect this from a startup, but we're self-funded and we have the means to do it. We have our own research team. So we've published, 30, 40 publications so far. Last December, we had our first New England Journal of Medicine publication, which was a big win for us. Yeah. So we're very much biased towards evidence and outcomes. And that, I think, is table stakes. And I think within the longevity and healthspan ecosystem, I'd love to see people take that bias to the extreme. For sure. Anything that you do, demonstrate that there are quantifiable outcomes and an ROI. At its core, you can break down, a longevity conversation into those things which are really focused on the basic science around biological unlocks, right? And at today's conference, we've talked about and seen a lot of that. That's not what we're focused on. You can think of us as the healthspan pragmatists, right? If you look at healthspan optimization and on a first principles basis, how do we achieve maximal healthspan optimization? Well, there are some low-hanging fruits, right? Before we get to, anything at the genetic level, anything at the sort of, experimental level, it's really about the decisions you make every morning for breakfast. It's about, are you taking the step counts that you need after your meals? It's about, are you managing your, actually, the 5 rules that I tell every patient, because I get these questions a lot. Hey, I've seen this thing on TikTok and there's this new experimental thing, and should I be on metformin, and should I take microdose of semaglutide, for health span? I'm like, listen, before you start doing all of that stuff, I want you to come back to me showing that you've done 5 things. Eat whole foods, treat sleep like it's a job with KPIs, track it and measure it. Walk frequently, preferably after meals. Lift heavy things to failure. That's a tough one because most people don't know how to do that, and you're prone to injury if you do it wrong. We can circle back on that. And then the last one is manage your stress actively. It's like if you haven't done those 5 things, which is the lowest hanging fruit, it's accessible to all of us, then, there's no point really in going to the fringe, more expensive, more less evidence-based in some cases, interventions. So that's kind of where our headspace is. We're very much, practical, pragmatists, evidence-based, on-the-ground, grassroots.
And I love the fact that what you touched on was the fact that it is eventually down to building a strong foundation.
Right.
Before you can build on that or tweak on that or optimize it with all these other either gerotherapeutics or other elements that are coming up. And you've often said that diabetes is a disease of habit and not glucose. And I mean, if that were true, why hasn't traditional coaching worked to solve that problem, which I'm sure, like you said, the Imperial College Diabetic Center would have done plenty of.
Right.
And then how does this sort of AI-driven approach differentiate, and how can it truly deliver better, and how scalable is it in low income or low economic, socioeconomic settings?
Let me abstract this a little bit. I went to a furniture exhibition in Italy called the Salone del Mobile.
Ah, nice one.
And I walked out feeling inspired, candidly. And when I flew back to Dubai, my wife said, "How was it?" I said, "I learned one thing. Italian furniture isn't made, it's born." Right? It works. And I think if you went to an Italian carpenter and said, "Is your approach a saw-driven approach or a screwdriver-driven approach?" he'd look at you and say, "What are you talking about? It's the outcome that matters. Look at the piece that I've created. I use all the tools in my toolkit, but the objective is to create a beautiful piece." There's a lot to learn from that.
Yeah.
And so my eyes glaze over when people ask me, a very AI-centric question. Because for me, all of the tooling that has existed and that continues to evolve, and a lot of things are evolving right now, are just tooling.
Yes.
It's part of the toolkit. Great. Add it to the roster. Use it when it's indicated. Use it when it's effective. So we do use a lot of tooling that has an AI element to it, but that's secondary, I think, to the human story. We've made mistakes. In our early days, I was an investor in another company, a very big investor in that company. I was on the board. And some very, very smart people, much smarter than me, were also investors in this company. And this company, purported to be, a wearables business with AI and all this other stuff. All the bells and whistles, all the right language in the pitch decks. And, we became a customer on the other side, and it just wasn't working. For a lot of reasons, but I'll give you one of the many reasons that it didn't work is that it wasn't clinically validated to the extent required that our physicians could understand it. And our physicians therefore could not articulate the value of it to the patients. And all it succeeded in really doing was increasing everyone's anxiety level. Because if you have an AI that's telling you you have a cardiovascular risk and now that risk has gone up by 20%, okay, what does that mean? So we burned our fingers early on in a misguided application of intelligence. What we do today is very different. So we build our own robust core tech stack, but we go out and find people much smarter than us who have invented things that are solving a particular piece of the puzzle and have done it in a way that is evidence-based. Either they have CE mark approval already or FDA approval. We'll reach out to those companies, we'll due diligence their clinical validation studies, and then we'll incorporate their technologies into our clinical workflows. So many of the AI-powered modalities that you'll see at our clinic, we're probably among the first in the world to use because we find them right after they've got FDA clearance. I'll give you an example that we've just implemented. When you're dealing with diabetics, and most of my patients today are not diabetic. They're people who don't ever want to become diabetic. So we've turned into a healthspan business. But on the diabetic axis, if someone's a poorly controlled diabetic, one of the primary and debilitating comorbidities is diabetic retinopathy. So diabetics will become blind. And so you'll want to do an annual screening for that. In the past, the diabetic would have to go to an ophthalmologist to have their eyes checked. But then somebody clever figured out, let me just put this is a machine vision problem, isn't it? So they put an AI system against it, and now you don't need an ophthalmologist. We were one of the first clinics to use this modality, where it's the same fundoscope, the camera that takes the picture of the retina, but there's no ophthalmologist. The image goes to the cloud, and in 10 seconds, I've got an answer, and it costs me almost nothing. It doesn't give me a diagnosis. It's not approved for that. It says either this patient's okay, or you need to refer the patient to an eye doctor. So it allows me to do wider screening for everybody all the time, high compliance, without spending a lot of money and worrying about billing and insurance. Now, fast forward till a few months ago. We found a Korean company that had taken the same retinal image and figured out a way to computationally derive a cardiac calcium score, which is something that ordinarily you'd have to go to an imaging center, sit in a CT machine, and get yourself scanned. So, a CT calcium score is sort of the gold standard best. And that's also something that's not really that frequently done, okay? So in and of itself, amazing innovation, very cool, brings down the unit cost. Okay, on its face, already interesting. But what's my role as an entrepreneur on the business side? How do I actually work this into clinical practice? And how do I find the reimbursements for it? So one of our patients, who is also a close friend, was healthy. I'm going to put that in air quotes because we're all, to a degree, on the gradients of health. But there was nothing active. He had gained some weight, and he was worried about that. And he wasn't feeling 100%. So he came to the clinic, and we did just the annual, because we do a lot of just executive health kind of stuff. And so he came in for his full checkup, and there was just something in it that the team didn't like. His blood pressure had been elevated since his last visit. Okay. He was complaining of just slowness, but nothing, no pains, no chest pains, nothing. He was still playing golf twice a week, active lifestyle, the weight gain. The EKG had some blips that the cardiologist wasn't happy with. So the team got together. Any other clinic would have just sent this patient home and said, look, lose some weight, sleep some more, come back in a month, come back in 6 months, whatever. Insurance company would not have approved, typically, any additional tests. There's no real hard indication. His blood pressure, it's elevated, fine, give him an antihypertensive. But we pushed. We pushed for a calcium score. This is a year ago, before the eye thing. And I'm just framing this for your audience for why it's important to think about processes and workflows and the way money flows and the way incentives work.
Absolutely.
Right? So we had to fight the insurance company. I mean, it's not that expensive, but it's still it's a bill. And if you have insurance, the insurance might as well pay for it. Weeks we fought the insurance company because they're like, it's not indicated. Our cardiologist, who's obviously now a cardiometabolic specialist on our platform, looks beyond the obvious. And she really fought for it. She's like, look, here are the clinical data that I'm using to to base my recommendation, and here's why I think it's important. Anyway, long story short, he got the approval eventually. Went and did the test, off the charts, massively calcified.
Yeah.
Great. So now there's an indication to go for a full CT scan with contrast, the CT angiogram. Again, we had to fight the insurance company for weeks. Yeah. Finally got the approval. We sent him over to the diagnostic center. He did the scan. They called us from the diagnostic center while he was still there, and we wouldn't let him leave.
Wow.
We sent him directly to the ER. By that night, he had 3 stents put in.
Wow.
95% blockage in 2 main arteries. And he was walking. Okay.
Wow.
So now let's re-examine the multiple failure points that could have happened.
Yeah.
We saved his life, and he's now one of our biggest champions. He's always been a champion. He's a lovely guy.
Yeah.
But now he tells people, these guys saved my life, which is incredible to think about, because he very easily could have ended up in a different place. One more day of delay on the insurance approval, right? So from a process and flow perspective, nothing to do with the scientific evidence and the basis, entirely to do with reimbursement and processes and so on. You got to think about this stuff as an entrepreneur building a business, especially when you're trying to disrupt things and move things away from old school, symptomatic, right? We're trying to be preventive. We're trying to uncover what the problem is. And in this case, it led to something massive. Now, that was super frustrating because you can expect that to happen again and again and again with every patient that presents this way. Because insurance companies will behave as they're incentivized to behave, which is reject, reject, reject. Now, with this new tech, we already have the equipment. It costs us nothing in terms of incremental cost in process. I'm now able to take a diagnostic event that I had to fight weeks for at the very end of the clinical diagnostic pathway and now bring it right up to the front.
Yeah.
I now do this retinal scan on every patient on their first visit. And I don't even bother with insurance pre-approval.
No.
If they approve, great. If they reject, fine. It's part of the math.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, now I'm collecting this data on every single patient, and I'm doing it in seconds. And it's adding a wealth of new information and helping me on this sort of more preventive health span philosophy rather than the symptomatic reactive thing. So I think that's kind of the role that we play in the ecosystem, is not only identifying real promise in terms of new technology and validating that, but then figuring out how to fit it into the workflows so that the doctors will know how to refer to it and use it, that we can eventually get reimbursed for it by the insurance companies. But most importantly, the patient centricity around doing the right things at the right time is kind of the guiding principle.
Fantastic. And that's a success story of this kind of collaborative, open API sort of open-minded approach to a technology product developer, let's say.
Yeah.
That you don't necessarily have to be the innovator of all what's great and good, collaborating with much smarter brains who are more focused on
you can never be.
problems.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of very clever people out there.
Exactly.
No one is going to have the full picture in their horizon.
Yeah.
And so, on the wearable side, we work really closely with the team at Aura. They're fantastic. We're doing multiple clinical studies with them. On the supplement side, working on gut microbiome issues. We're working with the team over at Pendulum on their Akkermansia-focused, probiotics, doing clinical trials with them. So, it's not common for startups to be investing so heavily in building the evidence base, but I think it's table stakes and will become ever more important, especially in the longevity space. Yeah. Because that's your only way to differentiate really in the market, is to go out and say, look, I've got this thing that'll improve your health span. Why should you believe me? Okay, I've got this, set of published evidence around, populations that look like you. And for me, on my own personal journey exploring this stuff, because I spent a lot of time researching, the biggest gap is in the evidence. Where I'll go to a clinic just to check them out, have a conversation. And this happened, I won't name names, but a major clinic here in Dubai. I went as a potential customer and I said, look, your program is extraordinarily expensive. What's my ROI on the intervention that you're proposing? And it was a health span longevity kind of an offering. And it was right over their heads. I was like, surely you've had people that look like me, my age, my demographic, male, no complaints, generally healthy, come in to do this, do you have evidence to show what my ROI is going to be over time? Like where are your publications? And there was nothing. So that's the big gap, honestly.
With your experience with the Aura Ring and this like overload of data that we receive as users of such devices, what's your position towards this overwhelming flow of data that we can get, and at the same time what the clinician are interpreting the data? What's the position you?
That's a really, really good question. So there's already too much data, but arguably, but too little actionable insight.
Right.
So we're all flooded now. If anyone wears a wearable, I mean, you get up in the morning and there's like 1,000 metrics to look at, and you fall into some rhythm.
Yeah.
I get up in the morning and I check my sleep scores, but how do you make sense of the full picture?
Yep.
Let's say you're wearing an Aura and a CGM, and you've got some fitness tracker that you're also using, and maybe you've also got a connected scale, and maybe you've got blood pressure issues, so you've got a connected cuff, and maybe you're a little bit more diligent and you actually make an effort to do food logging. That's still, I hope somebody solves that problem, because food logging is still a pain. So not only is there a lot of information, but that information sits in a lot of different silos. They're not really connected, and there's no one threading through it to give you an insight that's actionable. There's some companies that have tried to do it with point solutions. So there's certain companies, and I won't name names, but they've met with a varying degree of success, not a home run, but companies that have tried to say, here's how I predict you will respond to this particular food based on how you responded the last time you ate it. Okay, it's a good start. But there's so much left, because the response to food is so dependent on other metrics that company's not tracking. How well you slept, your stress levels. Did you, work out in the morning? Did you, have a stressful event at work? I mean, any one of these inputs will impact. And it's a very complicated multivariate problem.
Yeah.
That's hard, candidly, for an LLM to look at.
No.
LLMs are not designed to do that. I know there's a lot of talk about, a GPT being the savior for all things healthcare, and there being replacements for the clinical voice. But I think we should be cautious about those claims. Yeah. They're good at what they're trained to do. Yeah. But try to give them generalized intelligence, or try to expect generalized intelligence, I think is, there's flashes of insight that look promising, but I think, I'm not about to replace my doctors with AI. Okay. So we're all overloaded. And I think what we try to do for our patients is to be that translational layer. I talked about this yesterday, this notion of agency.
Exactly.
Right. And so the gap is not a data gap. The gap is not a technology gap. The gap is not a drug gap. Like, we have all those things. How do we make you a better version of you? We help you find what works for you. And that is partially based on your blood biomarkers and the clinical evidence that comes out from that. But it's also partially about helping you navigate the continuous data that you're producing on a daily basis, because there are tiny little changes that you can make that we can help you see that will help make you 1% better each day. And if I can make you 1% better each day, by the end of the year, you're a different person, right? So it's never going to be some like, wow, aha, here's your plan, follow this regimen. It's not that. People ask us, we have among the world's best outcomes today, humility aside. Our published outcomes are amazing on diabetes, on prediabetes reversal. We have better outcomes on the GLPs, on medicated weight loss, than almost anyone out there. And there's some other great companies that follow the same sort of behavior-driven philosophy, and they also produce great outcomes. People ask, what's the secret sauce? Like, tell me so I can do it. And I say, there is no secret sauce. The secret sauce is the platform itself, the process itself, that allows my team to help you figure out the path. So it's almost like this hyper-personalized, curated journey of self-discovery. Yeah. And And that will play an ever increasing role in every health span conversation, even if we're talking about some of the more sort of the new stuff coming out. You know, we're the healthcare pragmatists, but the guys that are the optimists on the biological side, you know, even in that, there's a degree of baseline that has to be done.
So in this reading of these immense and vast complex data sets that you have to play with, and the thread that has to be meaningful for each one of us, that is a personal thread out of the making sense of the data for me in my life now. How do you see that future coming to fruition? Is it there yet? Are we able to do that already? How far are we from getting a solution?
Very good question. So in order to be able to do that well and to do it on a personalized basis, all of us need to build our own personal data sets, which none of us today have.
Yes.
So the best we can hope to do today is generalized insight based on existing data sets that are not necessarily calibrated to you.
Yeah.
And that will get you somewhere. It's not useless. Okay. So you can do sort of patient like me type analytics to come to something that might be good enough. But in order to get to a point where you've got an intelligent clinician in your pocket that will be continuously looking at your data and giving you an insight based on that, you know, every AI system in the world operates the same way. It's trained on something against a ground truth that helps it. I mean, it's a statistical model at the end of the day, right? So you got to have high quality data. You got to have a ground truth. It's got to build that correlation, and then it's got to predict based on that, right? So to oversimplify it. So in order to do that for you, I need a lot of data on you. And we don't have that. So there's a lot of gaps. And actually, this is an interesting and important point when you think about the burden of data collection. A lot of our patients, they've gone through their transformational journey, or they're comfortable, they've learned enough, they're on the right track, and they feel good. They'll come and say, "Hey, Ali, do I still need to wear my Oura ring? Do you still want me to wear the CGM if they're diabetic, for example? Do I still need to continue food logging?" The food logging is the hardest one because that's the one that takes most time. And my response is always, look, do what's right for you, because this shouldn't be a burden, and you should feel like that's the outcome. Is how do you feel, and are you progressing in a way that you feel is sustainable? So that's priority. But beyond that, the best analogy is you can't go back in time and look at your kids' videos from when they were 5 years old 10 years ago. If you didn't upgrade the iPhone back then to the new version, you can't upgrade to a 4K video now. If that was 1080p or 480p or whatever, because you didn't upgrade and you didn't get the data back then, you cannot recreate that data. You cannot recreate the high resolution photo or high resolution video. Same is true for your own personal health data set from a longitudinal perspective. We're all changing every day. You today is not the same as you tomorrow, and you next week. It's not the same as you last year. There is value to having data to describe you last year, because you last year will help an AI figure out your target for who you want to be you tomorrow. Okay, sorry if that was unnecessarily complicated. But the point is, the more we track, the better equipped each one of us will be when learning models exist to digest, absorb, and make sense of your own personal data set. So what I tell people is, if it's not too much of a burden, keep doing it. The great thing about an Oura ring, once you get used to having a ring on your finger, just set it and forget it. It collects the data, even if you don't look at it. Fine. You've made the investment. You pay the monthly fee. It's tiny, minuscule amount. It's worth it. You're building your own person. That's an investment in your own asset, investment in yourself. The food logging, candidly, I don't even do it. I should. I should be listening to my own advice, and I should be more regularly, doing that. But that is, gosh,
in the next
not
classes maybe.
We'll all be wearing something that captures. But I mean, if you see the kind of Persian delicious food that I eat at home, I don't think there's an AI that'll figure out what's in that magical sauce of whatever. So that will remain a point of friction for a while. I think is this notion of capturing what goes in.
Yeah.
But everything else is largely, automated.
And speaking of personal journeys now, if it's okay, we'll just touch on your
Fat Ali?
personal journey. Not just Fat Ali.
Are you going to cut into the Fat Ali photo on the podcast here?
Look, Ali, who got expelled from medical school.
Oh, boy.
Who faced near bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And then sort of now professes this sort of earn the right to win philosophy, and how that shaped the way and who you are, and taking that further into the healthcare startup space in general, this resilience.
Yeah.
Is that something that should be innate in that space, or is this just a personal success story?
Is it innate? So I don't think it can be learned. It certainly can't be bought. It has to be experienced. There is value, and one should have gratitude for adversity. And I've faced incredible adversity, not to bore the audience, but getting expelled from medical school 3 times from the same school, which means I fought my way back in, was, and it was not an academic issue. Everyone, which camera am I looking at? Not an academic issue. It was very much because, I was an entrepreneur and I was doing things differently. And the dean at the medical school that I went to didn't like that. And that ended me in a lot of hot water. Yeah. But at the time, that was spine crushing, soul crushing event. Anyone who's been to medical school and on that path, you've got blinders on for your whole life. You're like, that's the only objective is like do well in your exams, and get to then, all professions, law school, whatever. It's all the same. Like as a kid, that is the only thing you really work towards and know. So when that was kind of ripped out of my life from a entity more powerful than me, the dean of the medical school at McGill, that was traumatic. Traumatic to the degree that I feel it changed me on a molecular level. Yeah. Not to be hyperbolic about it, but nervous breakdown level stuff. Wow. And every student is broke and bankrupt, but like for me, it was worse because I didn't have a job. I couldn't continue my studies. I did go back and finish my MBA because I was in one of these joint dual degree programs, but I had no idea what to do after that. No idea, clueless. I spent a year as a male model, which is not a well-known fact, and now I guess it's well-known.
We look back at the pictures.
This is pre-internet.
You
won't find that stuff. But yeah, it was dark days. Dark days. Only reason I got through it was my family, particularly my mother. Huge support, and you need that. But having survived it, having the grit to get through it, and you find a way when you're put in a position. This is probably essential to the philosophy of Stoicism, right? Be grateful for the obstacle because having the obstacle makes you stronger. Yeah. And so gratitude for that adversity is very much something that governs the way I do things today. I got through it, obviously, and I found a different path, ended up in Silicon Valley working on a sleep disorder diagnostic startup, which was part of the family business, and then got hired by Bain. They didn't care that I had gotten expelled. Actually, I think they saw that as a net positive. This guy's a square peg in a round hole kind of a thing. Yeah. Had a great career at Bain, and then everything else sort of happened as I described earlier. So that journey for me was tough, and I'm grateful for it. I wouldn't have it any other way. Now the question is there a lesson there that can be generalized to any new entrepreneur? Yeah. And I don't know the answer to that question because I was forced in that path. But one thing that I would say is seek failure.
Yes.
Seek it. Take the risk and seek it out. Actually, I had a conversation the other day with another really, really smart entrepreneur who's had his own share of ups and downs, Ali Parsa. And we were having this question about risk, conversation about risk. And he had a really interesting insight, which I think I'll now shamefully copy and repeat, is that, entrepreneurs are not risk takers in an irrational sense. We are risk optimizers, risk mitigators, in the sense that we understand the risk, we identify it, but then we figure out the best ways to mitigate that risk.
Yeah.
So really good entrepreneurs are actually really good risk mitigators, not reckless risk takers. And that made perfect sense to me. And I think that's a great insight, I think, for the audience. Gosh, I say this to my kids now, they're getting to the age where I can have these kinds of conversations, is that there's always a silver lining, no matter what. I mean, other than death. Yeah. And maybe in death, in some cases, there is too. But, seek failure, fail fast, and find the silver lining if that failure is of your own making, even if it's imposed upon you, as it was in my case. Find the benefit in it, because there's always something. So learning how to do that, I think, is difficult, because there's a certain, I don't want to call it, unbridled optimism, but there's a degree of patience, stamina and grit that one has to, I think, learn or adapt to, especially if you're in the thick of it. It's hard to think clear-headed when you're in the thick of it.
Absolutely. No, and that's such a great sort of takeaway of being able to embrace adversity and somehow turn that into a positive that actually drives you in the right direction.
Yeah.
Progress through adversity.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
so everyone should go and get expelled from medical school. That's the punchline.
Don't do it. On that note, we just want to thank you so much, Ali, for being here, inspiring us and sharing your story so candidly and really giving us tons of takeaways and insights. And
thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.